It has been a big week for American politics. Donald Trump all but clinched the Republican nomination on Super Tuesday, and all eyes were on President Joe Biden's State of the Union, where he gave a spirited defense of his administration's achievements, both at home and abroad. He faces big challenges on both fronts, at home with an intransigent Republican Party, and abroad with the war in Ukraine and Israel's continued siege on Gaza. Joining me now to talk about all of this is Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker, and Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of the Eurasia Group, a global risk consultancy. So, Ian, what do you think people will say, weeks from now, months from now about that State of the Union?
I doubt they'll be talking about it because we have a very narrow time frame on our news these days. But at least for the next few days, they're going to talk a little bit less about Joe Biden's unfitness and age, and they're going to talk a little bit more about the fact that that was a speech he needed to give. They haven't seen him for an hour plus out there in front of an audience, engaging and then giving a speech. This could have gone badly for him in lots of ways, and he avoided those pitfalls. In that regard, it was a very important speech.
What I'm struck by, Susan, is if you look at the polling, it does seem as though people approve of his policies more after the speech. Is that, you think, because, a lot of the things Joe Biden is pushing are popular, like having corporations and billionaires pay more taxes, reducing child poverty with credits and things like that. What do you think explains that? That's a fairly sharp rise in polling in a country which has often seemed very evenly divided.
Well, that's right. Many of the things that Biden is talking about, if people actually listen, it's getting them to listen is the hard part. Reproductive freedom is another big theme of the campaign this year. You're going to hear it over and over again from Democrats, from Biden on down. And remember, something like 2/3 of Americans, even many in very red states, are against the Supreme Court's decision to eliminate Roe versus Wade. And that will be powering a lot of the turnout. The problem, Fareed, is getting Americans to pay attention, to break through the noise. And also for Joe Biden, I think he had to reassure his own Democratic Party base and people who might vote for him that he was really up to waging the fight with Donald Trump. His bad poll numbers aren't because Republicans are against him. They already weren't going to vote for him. It's because he hasn't yet convinced his own electorate that he's really the guy to keep going for another term.
Susan, when you think about that opening, where he did something very unusual and dramatic, he began the speech really with a very impassioned plea for aid to Ukraine. Is there any chance that that changes the dynamic? Because this is a real world problem. Ukraine is really needs a lifeline, and it doesn't have it. Is anything going to change?
Well, Fareed, a couple observations. Number one, you saw Speaker Mike Johnson throughout the evening barely suppressing his uncomfortableness with the speech. And he's been very non-committal, including in an interview that he gave to reporters after the speech on Friday morning, where he's still refusing to even allow the matter of the $60 billion in additional military assistance and other assistance for Ukraine that Biden's asked for. He's still not agreeing to bring it to a vote, which is really tantamount to killing it in the sense that it would pass if it got to the floor. But for months now, remember, Biden sent up this request back in the fall, in October, and first was asking for more aid as early as last August. So it's been months and months of delay, which is tantamount to, leading to direct setbacks and deaths on the battlefield in Ukraine. The other thing that he did, Fareed, that I thought was very interesting is he's making an explicit connection between Trump's threats to American democracy and Vladimir Putin's threats to democracy in Europe. And I think that that's going to be a campaign theme throughout the year.
Yeah, I was struck by how, he's looking at a chamber that is half Republican and pretty squarely said, you guys tried to undermine democracy at home. You think that kind of combative rhetoric works well?
Unfortunately, no, because the country's too divided. I think anyone that supports Trump believes that this is all part of the problem and that democracy only works for the people that are in power, the elites, the establishment, including the media, including, sort of all these institutions that they don't believe in anymore. And so that argument doesn't work for them. But I do believe it was very smart for Biden to start with Ukraine. And a lot of people were surprised by that because the war is not going as well right now. But he knows that a majority of the men and women in that room support him on Ukraine, and they applauded. And that includes Speaker Johnson. He didn't stand, but he did applaud when Biden was saying we can't let these people down. We have to actually continue to provide support. And privately, Johnson has been working with Democrats and Republicans in Senate saying we want to find a way to bring this to a vote. If you made me bet right now, I think that you are going to see additional U.S. funding for Ukraine in 2024.
All right. When we come back, I'll ask our guests to talk about the Middle East and where that goes when we come back. And we are back with Ian Bremmer, the president and founder of the Eurasia Group, and Susan Glasser, a staff writer at The New Yorker. Susan, tell me what you made of Biden's both speech and policy on Israel-Gaza. He announced something that sounded bold, setting up a port that would allow humanitarian assistance. But when you look at the details, it's going to take probably 2 months before this is set up. It didn't seem that much of a deviation from a policy that he's had for months now, which is essentially to support Israel.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, what you're seeing is distancing, but it remains a cautious kind of distancing. And I do think the announcement of the sort of temporary port in Gaza, it's a remarkable symbolic gesture, if nothing else, in the sense that here you are with the U.S. military having to circumvent a blockade of people to get humanitarian aid in, a blockade that's being imposed by one of their own allies as opposed to an adversary. And I think to me, it's really symbolic of the moment in which the United States has sort of hugged Israel close, but what has it gotten for that? It doesn't have the leverage that I think many people thought it had over Israel's actions.
Ian, what do you think is going to happen? The Israeli operation continues. They invade Rafah. Where do you think this goes?
Look, the hope for the administration has been that they're going to get a temporary ceasefire 6 weeks in return for some of the hostages being released. It is getting closer to not happening, at least before Ramadan. And part of that is as Biden came out publicly and said very clearly to Netanyahu and the war cabinet, we really oppose you going on the ground in Rafah with ground troops. Hamas started engaging with a much tougher policy and saying we're only going to accept a permanent ceasefire and removal of all troops. So they feel like they're emboldened as Biden is pushing Netanyahu. This is a really impossible position for Biden to be in right now. The war, every day the war goes on, is worse for him domestically.
So what should he do?
I think he does need to push Netanyahu much more strongly. But what we've seen is this is too little and too late. He should have been starting to talk seriously about we're going to provide humanitarian aid on the ground with the Israelis or without the Israelis. Should have been months ago. And he should have been pressuring Netanyahu in the early days when he was being lied to, when they said that they were going to actually change how they were attacking in 2 weeks, that the war was going to be wrapping up in 2 weeks. They were getting that information every time they were talking to the Israeli government, and then they kept kicking the can down the road. So the Israelis are acting with impunity here. I like the fact that Biden and Jake Sullivan and the rest invited Benny Gantz to talk to them directly. Netanyahu told them not to go. It was exactly the opposite of what Netanyahu did to Biden and Obama when he came to talk to the Republicans in 2015 because of the Iranian nuclear deal. Where was Biden 5 months ago on this? He looks weak. It looks late. It's the one place where the Democrats, the State of the Union, were holding up signs saying ceasefire now. It's the one place there were demonstrations outside of the Capitol that actually blocked some of the streets beforehand. This is a problem for him at home, not just on the international stage.
Susan, you have great sources and great reporting always on this stuff. I sense that in the Biden White House, they probably still believe, and maybe they're right, that at the end of the day, it's a difficult one, but politically, net, you're better off backing Israel. In other words, Yeah, you may lose a certain number of people in Michigan, and you may lose a certain number of people. But generally speaking, those people often don't vote on foreign policy. But if you were to shift support from Israel, that would be, Jewish Americans are overwhelmingly Democratic. And if you break that piece of your coalition, that would be a big deal.
Yeah, I think you're right on the politics and the overall assessment of it. But I will say, Fareed, that I have heard really going back to the early weeks of this again and again from officials inside the White House, in the State Department, even in the Pentagon, a sense that, look, this policy is Joe Biden's policy personally, that he has sort of set up the constraints under which we're operating. You get the sense that if it wasn't Biden in the chair, but it was someone else, they would have been more critical and more public with their criticism of Israel earlier on, that it was the president himself who has determined this, and that in a way, Netanyahu, being aware of that, Biden has played the American government. Remember the political dynamic on Israel's end as well, which is Netanyahu is incredibly unpopular right now. There's a sense that many Israelis want to hold him to account for this, but that as long as the war goes on, they're not going to do that. Netanyahu has a built-in incentive to continue this conflict. It is in direct opposition in many ways to the political imperative of his supporter, Joe Biden, here in the United States, who needs it to be over as soon as possible. And on your point on Michigan, yes, it's true that overall, this might not be a voting issue for Americans. But if the election once again comes down to Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, remember, Hillary Clinton only lost that state by 10,000 votes in 2016.
When you look at the landscape going forward, do you think Biden, one of the puzzles of this period has been the economy is getting better, but people don't seem to be noticing it, or it doesn't translate into support for the president. Do you think that's changing?
I think it's not as much about vibes as people say. I do think that inflation is something that doesn't suddenly go away. The numbers are going down, but it's on top of a higher baseline. People are paying that. Interest rates are high. Rent is a much bigger piece of their income. I do think that this is a real challenge being actually felt by working and middle class Americans in the country. They don't feel great. Some of that is tribal messaging, but some of that is a reality. And let's hope that turns around. I think it is important to note that the United States economy is rebounding much more strongly than any other advanced industrial economy. So if you compare us to other countries that have gone through the same thing, the U.S. feels a lot better. And there are red state and blue state jobs. I think one of the most powerful parts of Biden's economic argument during the State of the Union was when he said, look at all these jobs, look at all this money we're spending. Hey, if any of you in this House want to give that money back, talk to me about it. There are more red states that have gotten jobs, right, from the Inflation Reduction Act than blue states. Those numbers have been important, and that is a benefit that the members of Congress would be hard-pressed to turn around.
Ian Bremmer, Susan Glasser, thank you so much, both of you. Next on GPS, I will talk to CNN's Jim Shooter about a fascinating near miss, a nuclear near miss on the battlefield in Ukraine. It's a stunning story when we come back.